Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. We turn to China-U.S. trade tensions, which are showing signs of easing, at least some believe. U.S. President Donald Trump said he would delay new tariffs from October the 1st to October the 15th toward China. China welcomes the U.S. gesture of goodwill. Earlier, China had announced a list of 16 U.S. items to be excluded from tariffs and said both sides are gearing up for another round of negotiations early next month in October. The conflict that started in March last year has disrupted global supply chains and rattled financial markets. But these recent moves indicate that China and the U.S. hope to resolve the trade row. So what will happen from now on until the upcoming talks, if there are any? Earlier, on the sidelines of China Development Forum held in Beijing, I spoke to two distinguished guests with different views. They're both from the U.S. The first, Scott Kennedy, who studied in China at the very beginning of the reform and opening up era, and is now senior advisor and trustee chair in Chinese business and economics at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He explained how best to comprehend the Trump administration's view on commerce, at least from his perspective. Let's listen in. Do you think that is likely to be the way the president thinks?
You know, obviously
Nobody can read his psychology, but...
I don't even think the best psychologist would be able to make out everything that he's thinking. But there is a basic logic to what he's doing. Partly it's political. He is a politician. Partly he's a deal maker, and he's trying to figure out how much pressure and he can put on China with different levers. At the same time, for 30 years, it's been very clear he's an economic nationalist. He thinks that the U.S. has been cheated by its trading partners, the Chinese, Europeans, Japan, reflected in big bilateral trade deficits, and that at the same time the U.S. has provided military support to its allies. And so he feels like the U.S. has been a victim the last 30-plus years, and so he's trying to redress that. It's a very different type of math than most use, but nevertheless, I think that genuinely motivates him to hold out for a bigger deal than many think. And I think even in Beijing, I've heard a lot of people ask me in and out of government, what happens when the U.S. stock market goes down? What happens when the president faces potential impeachment or questions like that? Will he lower his demands? And I think there's actually a pretty high floor below which he won't go in terms of his demands. Now, we can debate whether he should or he shouldn't, but just as an analyst, I don't think he's likely to lower them a lot. So then the question becomes, is China going to raise its offer? And there, I still think we've got a significant gap. Both sides still think they have the upper hand, which to me worries me, because I think given those conflicting expectations, this could be around with us for a while.
Now, a lot of the techniques used by the trade war between Japan and the United States back in the 1970s were being, quote-unquote, utilized this time as well, given the fact Mr. Lighthizer is the trade rep, and given the fact that there have been a lot of different voices in Washington. Mr. Kennedy, you studied very closely the history. How would you compare then and now, whether that is a smart choice?
Yeah, so I think you're exactly right, Tian Wei, that there are a lot of parallels born out of an experience from the 1980s vis-a-vis Japan. And there's several key components, several of which look very similar. Obviously, using tariffs or other types of arrangements against Japan and then against China, with the expectation that the American market is so large, so important, that that would have such an effect on Japan or China's economy, in this case, that they would have to make major concessions. Also doing it on our own, as opposed to doing it through back then the GATT, or now the WTO, or with a group of countries plurilaterally vis-a-vis China. I think another thing that's really interesting now, and I can't speak for the 1980s, is that the negotiations now are intentionally, by the American side, kept to a very small group of people. Now, most of the time, if you go back during the most recent administrations, Bush, Obama, you would see hundreds and hundreds of negotiators on both sides. Now you're looking at very small groups. It's not good for the airline industry or hotel industry, but it's meant to focus the conversations around principles. But one of the challenges of that is the principals still need to have information, and they can't know everything. I think another reason that the U.S. wants to do that is that if they bring 100 negotiators to negotiation, the Chinese will negotiate with 100 people one by one and find all the weaknesses in the U.S. side. So actually, from the perspective of China experts within the U.S. government, it's a pretty quiet time. Go to work at 9, go home at 5, no weekend work, because you don't have to actually get ready to go to the negotiating table because you just have a few people there. And so limiting the negotiations has the benefit of really focusing attention on the decision makers. On the other hand, it's not clear that they have all the information that they should.
What kind of progress are we talking about if we look at the political agenda? For the U.S. election, it's the biggest thing. And many even say this election is ever more important than the last one.
Yeah.
So what would that mean for the overall atmosphere, timeline, tactics, agenda, and goal of this negotiation?
Sure. Well, I tend to take a little bit different view than most folks. I know that America is a democracy, and every 4 years we have a big election, and our leaders calculate how different policy issues are going to affect their standing vis-a-vis voters in those elections, vis-a-vis business, what it's going to mean for the business cycle, and they want the economy to look good and for there to be successful deals just before elections. I understand that general logic, and I think President Trump is probably as sensitive to anybody about polls and his standing than just about anybody. I think he lives and breathes, walks, sleeps polling and how people look at him, right? That's critical for him. On the other hand, as I said before, he has some of these basic beliefs about the relationship with China and the U.S. relationship with the rest of the world, and the sense of unfairness. And so the election factor may lead him to moderate some of his positions at certain times. On the other hand, again, I think there's a floor beneath which he won't go because of those strong sentiments that he's held for a long time. So it's possible that as we get closer to the election, maybe he will soften a little bit, but I don't think we should overexpect that. And the same side on the Chinese side, if China's economy softens, are we going to see China really relax its goals? I think the way out of that type of psychoanalysis is really just two sides figuring out what's in their best interests. Speeding up economic reform is good for China, regardless of whether the U.S. wants it. And for the U.S., improving the relationship with China is good for the U.S. as well.
Mr. Kennedy, you've been doing research about China for a long time. But you are one of those very representative among the so-called younger generations of China hands.
Why, thank you. I'm not so young, but appreciate it.
But, you know, looking at where the relationship is, what do you think going to be the nature of coexistence, in a way, between China and the United States? Because neither could destroy each other in the way that they want. And therefore, the coexistence is a matter of fact. But how?
Well, I mean, I've been coming to China for 30-plus years. And, you know, I first went to school just down the street. And when I went to school there, China was an exciting place for me, very different from...
Maybe 5 or 6 blocks away from here.
Just very, not too far at all, really. We could walk there in a few minutes, probably. No private cars on the road, no restaurants, no hotels, very different. But there was a deep curiosity from Americans who were here, only a few hundred of us in the late 80s, from Chinese trying to learn about, you know, there were these salons and English corners and all types of creative exchanges going on. Actually, we knew a lot less about each other, but we were super curious in both directions. Taking a train in China in the 1980s was an opportunity to face interviewers tougher than you for hour after hour, but very exciting.
Yeah.
And
meaning the common people who want to approach
absolutely.
you and talk to you.
Sitting a hard seat from here to Guangzhou,
oh, wow.
that's a long time to get to talk to people.
You got one of those experiences?
Indeed.
Good for you.
Indeed, for terrific. Now you're on a high-speed train or a plane and you're not talking to anybody. It's actually not as
You're
fun.
on your phone most of the time.
I know, everyone's just doing this. So, and you're connected back to the United States or Europe, and you're not, the environment is totally different. But now we are interconnected deeply. We are part of one world, one language, one community, one scientific world, and we have to figure out how to address these real challenges. We do have issues about who gets a little bit more, who gets a little bit less, what this means for the global macroeconomy, but we have some really big challenges that we both face. Obviously, everyone knows about climate change. Technological progress is good for everyone, but it also requires lots of changes. If you look at AI, automation, that means lots of people are going to not have jobs.
But they're not up for the job. They're not up for the job. That's the thing.
Yes, yes. So
are we going to disappoint our future generation in a big way?
I'm really worried about the rise of nationalism and populism in lots of places, east and west. I'm really worried about the inequality that is partly feeding into that, and that sense of unfairness and victimization that people who haven't been the winners feel, and is leading to a challenge of our political institutions, any sources of authority. We've got to address those. And so we need to play defense appropriately on old issues, but we need to play offense together on the new issues. Otherwise, the world as we know it right now will look a lot better compared to what it could be.